everyone. Welcome and thank you for coming. Tonight's Mill series is delighted to host Professors Matthew Kroenig and Andrew Ko, two nuclear security experts who will be discussing the question, should Trump have pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal? My understanding is that our two speakers do not entirely converge in their answers to this question, so it should be an interesting conversation. Briefly, Professor Kroenig is an associate professor in both government and foreign service at Georgetown University. He has published numerous books and articles on nuclear weapons proliferation, including the 2018 book, The Logic of American Nuclear Strategy, with Oxford University Press. He has done multiple stints at the CIA and the Pentagon. At the Pentagon, he was lead author of the first ever U.S. government-wide strategy for deterring nuclear terrorism, and he developed strategic options for addressing Iran's nuclear program. He also served as a foreign policy advisor for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign, and as a senior national security advisor for Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign. Andrew Ko is an assistant professor in political science at Vanderbilt University. According to Professor Van Dyke, who met him in grad school, he is insanely smart. Professor Ko's research focuses on international responses to the spread of nuclear weapons, rationalist explanations for costly conflict, and the economic origins of modern politics. Prior to entering academia, he worked for several years at the Institute for Defense Analyses, where he helped design the Homeland Security Department's terrorist risk assessment system and was lead author of several official war scenarios used for planning for the Pentagon. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professors Matthew Kroenig and Andrew Ko to Lafayette.
I just want to start with a little bit of background to the Iran deal to sort of make sure everyone's on the same page. I'm going to focus on the broad politics that led to the deal rather than the technical details on the assumption that that's what you'll find more interesting. So as background, the United States and Iran's government have had very serious conflicts of interest for several decades now. This is not a new problem. They differ largely in how they think Iran and the larger Middle East should be organized, what they think the economy should look like, what they think appropriate political behavior is, and how they think those countries should relate to others in the region. Iran faces the problem that even though it has a very different idea from the United States about how the Middle East should be run, it's quite a bit weaker, at least in conventional terms. It doesn't have the same military power as the United States. It doesn't have the same network of alliances around the world, and it doesn't have the same kind of economic weight that the US does. So as a result, it's tried to contest the balance of power in the region through unconventional means. Okay, this is why Iran does things like sponsor terrorist organizations in the region, sponsor insurgencies in countries that are suffering civil conflict. These things are intended to undermine regimes that are friendly to the United States in the hopes of influencing them or replacing them with governments that are more sympathetic to Iran's interests. So Iran is in the midst of exploiting the temporary vacuums of power in places like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen. They're also pursuing weapons of mass destruction, or rather they were, including nuclear weapons. That's now a matter of public evidence, but it was long suspected. In response to these efforts on Iran's part, the United States has long undertaken a policy to try to contain Iran, doing things like stationing military forces in the Middle East so that they could deter Iranian military opportunism, trying to build up the capabilities of regional allies, waging campaigns against the terrorist organizations and insurgencies that Iran sponsors, and finally imposing economic sanctions on Iran. So as of the late 2000s and early 2010s, it appeared that this policy was in some respects failing. Okay? The best estimate was that Iran was quite close to achieving success in its nuclear weapons program. All the evidence that has followed from that suggests that that intelligence estimate was correct. And so the United States had essentially three options for what to do given the failure of containment. The first is it could simply tolerate what was going on and allow Iran to go nuclear. I think it's fair to say that the expert consensus is that that would be very bad for U.S. interests, even worse for the interests of U.S. allies in the region, and possibly even bad for Iran's people to the extent that it prolongs a fairly unjust regime. The second option was to use force to try to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, launching a set of limited attacks designed to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities. That would be by no means a permanent solution to the problem. Those facilities could always be rebuilt. They would probably have to be struck again. At the time that this is going on, the United States is suffering what's widely considered a disaster in Iraq. Its military is tied down there. War with Iran, which might result from those strikes, would be war with a country that has 3 times the population of Iraq, a much stronger military, and is much more popular with its people than Saddam's dictatorship was with the people of Iraq. At the time, the U.S. public appeared to be very fatigued by interventions in the Middle East. It's clear that yet another war in the Middle East would have been extremely expensive. And as a result of that, the United States chose a third option, which was to try to make a deal. Okay, so it engaged in negotiation with Iran. The idea is we will stop them from pursuing nuclear weapons, still act to try to contain the other things they're doing in the region, like sponsoring terrorist organizations. And by making this deal, we will at least have avoided war with Iran or their acquisition of nuclear weapons. So the deal saved both sides the costs of what the U.S. might have done in the absence of a deal, like attacking. The trade was that Iran agreed to certain limits on its program, and in exchange, the U.S. made concessions to Iran's interests, particularly relaxing U.S. and multilateral sanctions on Iran's economy. In no respect did the deal solve the underlying problem between the United States and Iran. It's still the case that they have a very serious conflict of interests. All that happens after the deal cut off Iran's pursuit of nuclear weapons is that Iran was inclined to rely more heavily on the other unconventional ways it was trying to shift power in its favor in the region. Relaxing the sanctions against Iran gave it more resources to do things like sponsoring terrorist organizations and participating in insurgencies. So it's no surprise that very soon after the deal was agreed, it appears that Iran has increased its support for these things and has become even more directly involved in civil wars in places like Syria and Yemen. The deal is far from perfect. Okay, it sets a bad precedent. As part of the deal, Iran was allowed to retain the capability to make enriched uranium, and in fact, the capability to enrich it up to the point that it could be used for a nuclear weapon. Right? That is actually a pretty rare thing. Most countries don't have that ability. And this is, in fact, the first time that the United States has agreed to allowing a hostile government to possess this capability. As a result of that, other countries have expressed an interest in getting these capabilities, including U.S. allies. That's probably a direct result of seeing that the U.S. was willing to tolerate it in the case of Iran. Another problem with it is that the agreement itself is temporary. Many of the most important limits expire in the next 7 years or so. Soon after, many more limits will expire. Eventually, all of them will disappear. The entire deal is temporary. So in some sense, it just kicks the problem down the road a little ways. And the third problem with the deal is that it doesn't really resolve the other issues with Iran. The deal says nothing about Iran's pursuit of ballistic missiles or its sponsorship of international terrorism. It's still allowed to do those things, at least as far as the deal goes. It is possible, I can't say with any confidence, that the United States could not have gotten a better deal than the one it got. We can identify lots of things about the deal that are not perfect, that are run counter to U.S. interests. The negotiation over the deal is largely an exercise in trying to figure out just how far can we push the Iranians before they decide it's not worth it. Okay, so the Iranians have every incentive to try to hide exactly what they're willing to give up in exchange for the U.S. dropping sanctions on them. The U.S. has to make a guess about exactly how far they can be pushed, and the harder it pushes, the more risk it takes that they abandon the negotiations and try to get nuclear weapons, or that the United States ends up having to attack them as a result. Okay, so holding out for a better deal at the time, as some, including some sitting here, argued at the time, may well have worked out successfully, but it also ran the risk that it would end up either leading to a breakdown of the negotiations because Iran decided to resume its program, or to fracturing the international support that was essential for the United States, its ability to leverage Iran in the negotiations. The principal way the deal is enforced is by the threat that if Iran cheats on the deal, or if it continued rather than agreeing to the deal, then it might get attacked by the United States, and even if it didn't get attacked, it would be suffering severe sanctions imposed by much of the rest of the world. The ability of the U.S. to do these things, to credibly threaten that it could maintain severe sanctions on Iran, even to credibly threaten to attack it, relies to some extent on getting international support for those things. Okay. If the Obama administration had pressed further for a less generous deal to Iran, it would be running the risk that the international community would conclude that the real intransigent party here was not Iran, but rather the United States. It would refuse to support further coercion of Iran, and the United States' hand in the negotiations would be much weakened. So for that exact reason, I think the decision to pull out of the deal was a bad idea. Fundamentally, in doing so, the United States appears to be the problematic party to the rest of the international community. Our allies in Europe and elsewhere have responded quite negatively to this. They are in the business at the moment of trying to keep the deal on life support. They're attempting to provide Iran with the concessions that were agreed under the deal to a large enough extent to make up for what it's losing from the United States. As a result, it's created a pretty serious dispute between the United States and its allies. And in the absence of support from those allies, it's difficult to imagine that the United States could develop the kind of credible threat that it needs to extract further concessions from Iran. Okay, so in some sense, what's happened is that Iran is still restraining its nuclear program as long as it feels like the deal is being given support by the Europeans and others. But the United States now appears to be the problem actor, and now has less leverage than it had before in a few years when it's time to renegotiate the deal when its limits begin expiring. So I guess I'll just conclude by saying that the risk here is that either the Europeans and China and Russia manage to keep the deal alive, they manage to keep Iran convinced that it's better off continuing to stop its nuclear program and accepting concessions from these states, even if the U.S. isn't going to play ball, which is only going to make an increasing conflict of interest between the United States and these other countries. Or what's going to happen is that Iran concludes that Europe and the rest aren't actually able to give it enough concessions to make up for the absence of the U.S. from the deal. They resume their nuclear program, and we're back in the position we were in the late 2000s or early 2010s, when the only way to stop them is to either allow it to happen or resort to force. So I guess my view of this in sum is that the deal is not great, okay? Kind of a bad option, but possibly, or in my opinion, most likely the least bad of the available options to the United States. Thank you.
Well, good evening. First, I'd like to say it's a pleasure to be here speaking at Lafayette College in the Mills series. I'd like to thank Professor Van Dyke for the invitation. And thanks to you for coming out, and thanks to Professor Koh. It's good to be on stage debating an old friend and colleague. And he gave us a very fair-minded, I think, opening set of remarks. So we agree on a lot, actually. We just disagree on the final judgment. So I think it was the right move for the Trump administration to pull out of the Iran nuclear deal, which I think was a flawed agreement. So in my opening remarks, I'd like to make 3 points. I think first, talk about how close Iran is to developing nuclear weapons, what the technical capability is. Second, talk about the threat that would be posed by a nuclear-armed Iran and why we want to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. And then third and finally, talk about the flaws in the deal and why I think the Trump approach is a superior approach. So first, to make nuclear weapons, maybe you know this, to make nuclear weapons, a country has to do three basic things. First, they have to produce the fuel that goes in the core of the nuclear device. Second, they actually have to make the nuclear warhead, use that fuel to make a nuclear warhead. And then third, they need some ability to get that to their adversaries. So ballistic missiles, aircraft, submarine launch ballistic missiles are the three delivery vehicles the United States uses. So where is Iran on this set of capabilities? Well, it already has the most sophisticated ballistic missile program in the Middle East, already has the ability to deliver ballistic missiles to other countries in the region, including Israel. The U.S. Missile Defense Agency estimates that Iran could have the ability to deliver ballistic missiles to the continental United States within the next several years. So that third part of the problem they've got solved. Second, forming the nuclear warhead is actually fairly simple. Best estimates are that Iran probably has that capability already or could soon have it once it has the fuel. So the hardest part of building nuclear weapons is actually producing the fuel, enriching uranium or reprocessing plutonium. So Iran has a uranium enrichment program. It's allowed to have a uranium enrichment program under the terms of the deal. According to the best estimates, if Iran's supreme leader made the decision today to produce as much highly enriched uranium as fast as possible, that he could have enough fuel for his first nuclear weapon within about 1 year. So potentially we're 1 year away from an Iran with a bomb. So this is a pressing issue. Second, what's the threat posed by a nuclear-armed Iran? And I think Professor Koh is right. There's bipartisan agreement that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable. So if Iran acquires nuclear weapons, it's likely it wouldn't stop with Iran. Other countries in the region might develop nuclear weapons in response. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Egypt, potentially others. Saudi Arabia has said whatever nuclear capabilities Iran develops, it will develop too. In addition, Iran could transfer sensitive nuclear material and technology. I actually wrote my first book on this issue called Exporting the Bomb, and everything we know about this suggests that Iran would be a country at risk of transferring nuclear technology. And it would weaken the broader nuclear nonproliferation regime. Iran would be, maybe with North Korea, the only country to sign the nuclear nonproliferation treaty and then cheat within the treaty and build nuclear weapons. So we've had several successive U.S. presidents say that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable. If we stand by and allow Iran to build nuclear weapons, that broader nonproliferation regime is weakened. In addition, Iran would likely be more aggressive in the region. So Iran's leaders explicitly say that they'd like to be the most powerful state in the Middle East. But we know right now that Iran restrains its foreign policy because it fears that if it goes too far, it could lead to military reaction by the United States or by Israel. But with nuclear weapons, Iran could use the nuclear weapons essentially as a shield to deter U.S., deter Israeli military action, and be more aggressive in the region, more aggressive course of diplomacy, so potentially leading to an even less stable Middle East, if you can imagine that. And then third and finally, a nuclear-armed Iran could lead to nuclear war. And I wouldn't want to exaggerate this. I don't think the risk is high, but it's not zero. Because we've seen throughout history that nuclear-armed states frequently get into high-stakes crises with other nuclear-armed states. So in the future, a nuclear-armed Iran could get into crises with the nuclear-armed United States, nuclear-armed Israel. In the future, maybe even other nuclear-armed states, Saudi Arabia. And in those high-stakes crises, things could always spiral out of control. So I don't think any of us believe that JFK was crazy. Yet after the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy said the risk of nuclear war with the Soviet Union was somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2. So JFK was willing to run a 50% chance of nuclear war with a nuclear-armed superpower over missiles in Cuba. So what's the risk of nuclear war that Iran's supreme leader would run in a future crisis with the U.S. or with Israel? Again, I don't know the answer, but I know that it's greater than zero. So this is a serious threat. There's good reason why 3 successive U.S. presidents have said that a nuclear-armed Iran is unacceptable. So what are our options for dealing with it? Well, one is the military option, as Professor Koh mentioned, and the United States has an effective military option. It could destroy Iran's nuclear facilities, but it would lead to significant cost. Iran would likely retaliate. There would be other costs as well. So it's not a good option. But every president, including President Obama, said that option is on the table to stop Iran from building nuclear weapons. Everyone agrees, however, that if we can solve this diplomatically, that would be the best way forward. So the Obama administration's deal, in my view, was not sufficient to address the problem diplomatically. So why do I say that? So if you only remember one thing from my talk tonight, remember this point. I think it's the most important point. There's a big difference between operating nuclear reactors for peaceful purposes, for research, for producing energy. A big difference between that, a legitimate civilian nuclear program. Big difference between that and making the fuel for the reactors. Because once you can make the fuel for the reactors, you can also make the fuel for nuclear weapons. So US policy going back to Eisenhower has been to try to draw a line between these things. Say, if you want reactors, great, we'll help you. We even helped Iran build its first research reactor in the 1950s. But to say, you can't make the fuel. If you want the fuel, we'll give it to you. The French will provide it. The Russians will provide it. And so that's been a standard that the United States has enforced even on its closest allies. So in the 1970s, Taiwan, South Korea wanted to produce nuclear fuel, and we came down on them hard and said this is unacceptable, the proliferation risk is too large. So in 2002, when it was announced that Iran was trying to make nuclear fuel secretly, cheating on the NPT, the US response was immediate and obvious and automatic. We said this is unacceptable. Iran can't make the fuel, it can't enrich uranium. If it wants a peaceful program, great, we'll help them. Russia will provide the fuel, but Russia didn't want to do that. So when Obama came to power, he said the same thing. He said, my administration is going to stop Iran's enrichment program. So we tried, and it was too hard. And so with this deal, what we did, Obama said, okay, we'll make a big exception for Iran. We'll allow Iran to have 2 enrichment facilities. We'll allow it to have 6,000 of these machines, these centrifuges. We'll allow it to enrich to certain levels. And so this didn't solve the problem it was intended to solve. We've allowed Iran to keep this fuel-making capability. As Professor Ko said, this set a bad precedent. Saudi Arabia, South Korea, other countries since then have said, if Iran can enrich uranium, so can we. How do you trust Iran, basically a US enemy that's cheated on its non-proliferation agreements to enrich uranium, when you don't trust us, the South Koreans, a democracy, a formal treaty ally? And so it weakened that non-proliferation standard. In addition, as Professor Ko pointed out, it doesn't permanently solve the problem. The limits on Iran's enrichment capability are temporary. So we allow them to enrich with some limits, but then those limits expire over time. And so 10 to 15 years when the deal was signed, but we're now 3 years in, so 7 to 12 years. The most important limits expire. So even President Obama said that when the deal expires, the time it will take Iran to build nuclear weapons, quote, shrinks almost down to 0. So as Professor Ko said, we didn't solve the problem, we just bought ourselves a few years. In addition, it doesn't cover other important threats posed by Iran. As Professor Ko pointed out, the ballistic missile program continues to advance. In fact, the deal lifted some of the limits that had been in place on the ballistic missile program. And it doesn't say anything about Iran's other behavior in the region, interfering in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria. And so the Trump administration came in and said, we feel like we're in a bad place here. We've got a couple of years limits on this nuclear program, but then what do we do when that expires? And plus, our best tools for dealing with these other problems are off the table. And I should point out, Trump was a relative moderate among the Republican candidates in the 2016 election. So in the 2016 presidential campaign, all the other Republican candidates, Cruz, Rubio, Walker, said that they would tear up the deal on day one. Trump was a relative moderate. He said he wanted to renegotiate the deal. He wanted a better deal. And so that's what he tried for the first year. He went to the Europeans and said, I want to renegotiate this deal. Here's what we see as the problems. These sunset clauses, the fact that the limits expire is a problem, the fact that it doesn't cover ballistic missiles is a problem, the fact that it doesn't cover support for terrorism is a problem. And the Europeans said, okay, we can get on board on the last two. We'll work with you on the terrorism issue. We'll work with you on ballistic missiles. But the sunset clauses, these limits expiring, that was an important thing to Iran that we negotiated. Trying to go back on that would be going back on our word. We can't go that far. So the Trump administration tried to renegotiate, couldn't get there because of the Europeans. And so they decided the only way to get Iran to come to the table and get Iran to negotiate over making these limits permanent or shutting down enrichment altogether was to increase the pressure on Iran. And so the only way we could do that was by reinstating sanctions. The only way we could do that was by pulling out of the deal. So in May, the Trump administration pulled out of the deal. Secretary of State Pompeo gave a speech at Heritage where he laid out the Trump Plan B very clearly. He laid out 12 objectives of negotiations, importantly getting Iran to shut down its enrichment program altogether, and said that we'll increase pressure on Iran through sanctions and other measures to force Iran to the table to discuss a better deal. So, many said that it's going to be hard to get economic pressure on Iran. I think we're seeing that the sanctions are having more of an effect than many people expected. Many people said that it's unrealistic to expect the Iranians to come to the table and renegotiate. Rouhani has already said that he's open to coming to the table and renegotiating. So I think getting a permanent deal that solves this altogether is going to be difficult. Wouldn't want to sugarcoat it. We have no good options, but that's the Trump administration approach, to try to put serious pressure on Iran to get them to come to the table, to get a deal that doesn't just kick this problem down the road, but that resolves it once and for all. So I'll end my opening remarks there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Professor Koh, I read that Iran may save money gained from reduced sanctions. Even if sanctions are reapplied, Iran would still have the money to invest in a nuclear program. Would the West still be a dominant power bloc with a nuclear Iran? And if not, is that a problem?
So I guess I would say the issue, so for Iran to pursue nuclear weapons, money was never really the issue. Like, Iran pursuing nuclear weapons is not actually all that expensive for a large country like Iran. Even when they were under pretty severe sanctions, they still had enough money to continue the program. That's merely a matter of them making it a high enough priority for government spending. I tend to agree with Matt's view about why it's bad if Iran gets nuclear weapons. And the fundamental issue is simply that today we live in a world in which if the United States or one of its allies were to come to blows with Iran, Iran can fully expect to lose that war and lose it badly. And there's very little Iran can do about it. And as a result of that, Iran has to be extremely hesitant in pursuing its interests in the regions to avoid giving the United States or one of its allies cause to use force against it, because that would not work out well for Iran. So the issue with nuclear weapons is that if they have nuclear weapons, that entire equation changes. So if they have nuclear weapons, they can place a hard limit on what the United States or any other country is going to be willing to do to use force against them. So if, say, Iran were to, or one of the organizations that is sponsored were to successfully, say, overthrow, let's say, the Kuwaiti regime or the Saudi regime, today the United States would not hesitate to intervene to redress the situation and to retaliate against Iran for that. If Iran has nuclear weapons, that retaliation is going to have to be a lot more limited, because you have to worry that you don't want to go so far against them that they decide that it's worth using nuclear weapons to put an end to it. So, I tend to agree. I think not all people, but most people who study this agree that if Iran gets nuclear weapons, the distribution of power in the region is going to shift quite substantially. And the result of that shift is going to be a series of outcomes that are very bad for the United States, very bad for its allies in the region.
All right, well, I guess this is a question for either of you. So most of the talk has focused on preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons as the only goal of the deal. But there's been some talk among its proponents that buying time gives some time for the character of the regime in Iran to change, 7 to 15 years. So my question is the problem a nuclear-armed Iran, or is the problem a nuclear-armed version of the current Iranian regime? Are there some reasonable changes besides the emergence of a liberal democracy that the regime could take in the next decade or so that would make a nuclear Iran acceptable?
The United States has actually been very consistent in its non-proliferation policy for the past several decades. So we've opposed the spread of nuclear weapons to everyone, to both friends and enemies. So we don't want Taiwan to develop nuclear weapons. We don't want Japan to develop nuclear weapons. We don't want Germany to develop nuclear weapons. And so even if Iran became a liberal democracy tomorrow, aligned with the United States, became our best friends, we still wouldn't want it to get nuclear weapons. Our policy is that the spread of nuclear weapons to any country is dangerous for international security. But I think the other thing implied by your question, though, was what was the goal of the Obama administration approach? Was it also to try to change the character of the regime? And here there was a difference between the public messaging and I think some of the private calculations. So publicly, they said this is a very narrow arms control agreement meant to cap Iran's nuclear program. It doesn't have any broader ambitions. But that gets to the question of what do you do then in 10 or 15 years when the deal expires? And so their Obama administration officials, when I'd press them, they would say, well, 10 to 15 years is a long time. Who knows? It might be a fundamentally different country by then. So I think that was the assumption you had to make in my view, to really defend the deal, that 10 to 15 years from now, things are going to be better than they are today. So not an explicit objective. And I think some of the debate today is about, I think everybody agrees that it would be a wonderful thing if you had a more democratic government in Iran that respected the human rights of its people. And so I think part of the debate today is how do you get there? I think some people believe that by lifting sanctions on Iran, engaging Iran into the global economy, that would lead to changes inside the regime. I think others advocating pressure believe the opposite, that by hurting Iran economically, making it difficult for the Islamic Republic to produce a functioning economy, that's going to be one of the things that leads to change in Iran. Final point on this, Dennis Ross, who was Obama's senior director for Middle East policy at the White House, put it pretty succinctly, and he said that he doesn't think regime change in Iran is possible as long as two things are true. So he said, one, the regime is willing to kill to stay in power, and we've seen that time and time again. And two, the Iranian people haven't been willing to die to take it. And as long as that's true, I don't think any amount of economic pressure or sanctions relief is going to change that fundamental equation.
Professor Kroenig, you said that proponents of the deal sort of have to implicitly accept the possibility of regime change. Professor Koh, as a proponent of the deal, do you accept that possibility?
So, I mean, I agree there was I would characterize it as a hope rather than an ambition or an expectation on the part of the Obama administration that this might be the beginning of something like a rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran. You know, maybe we start with this problem that is the most pressing problem at the moment, and if we can get a deal with them on this, if the deal is upheld over time, then maybe they will become, it will be easier to develop the level of trust necessary to make additional deals. I don't know, my view from talking to people like Colin Call, who's on the National Security Council staff during the negotiations, was they don't actually expect that to happen. It's just there's a non-zero chance it could happen, and it would be really great if it did happen. And they believe that the probability that happens is higher if the U.S. makes a deal than if it doesn't. But I also think, suppose you believed that there's zero probability, there's no chance whatsoever that the Iranian regime is going to be any different when the deal expires than it was when the deal was made. Even if you think that's true, keep in mind the environment in which the deal is made. The Middle East is in chaos. The United States has massive deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. It's completely tied down in these countries. And that's not going to last forever. At some point in the future, the United States is going to be out of these places. The U.S. public is going to become less fatigued about war and so on, and more willing to countenance the use of force again to protect American interests in the Middle East. And as a result, the U.S. is going to have a stronger hand in negotiations. So for me, one of the principal virtues of the Obama administration's deal with Iran is that it's a response to this moment in which there's a pressing problem that the U.S. doesn't really want to deal with in any final way, at least not if it involves the use of force. And so what they do is make this deal which says this is going to give us at least a decade, and maybe more, in which we don't really have to worry about this problem. And a decade down the line, if it turns out that Iran is not willing to renew this deal, or they're not willing to make a deal that's more satisfactory for the United States, we'll be in a better position to make threats that force will be used if they don't respect American national security interests.
Can I comment on this?
Yeah.
Sir?
Yeah.
So I think Professor Koh and I agree on a lot. Here's one difference in interpretations, because I think the United States and the Obama administration was actually in a very strong position when the deal was struck, and Iran was in a weak position, and the deal doesn't reflect that bargaining power. So Iran was on the wrong side of 8 UN Security Council resolutions saying that it needed to shut down its enrichment program. It was being battered by tough international sanctions. Not only did you have the US sanctions, you had a European oil embargo. Iran couldn't export its oil. You had a credible threat of military force. It was clear at that point that Iran was the intransigent actor. And by striking this deal, we changed that dynamic. So we get a UN Security Council resolution that says that Iran can have an enrichment program. So we enshrine in a UN Security Council resolution that this illegal nuclear program is now legal under international law. The Europeans lift their sanctions, rush in to try to do business. So we lift the economic pressure. And also with the deal, we lifted some of the military pressure. So Iran's now importing advanced air defenses from Russia, S-400 air defenses, which will make it more difficult for Israel or the United States to take military action in the future. So I think we were in a very strong position, and by striking this deal, we've undercut some of our own leverage.
Professor Kroenig, I read that American allies are upset at over our exit from the Iran deal. I'd like to ask, wouldn't it be better for America and its allies to stand as one united front against Iran in order to prevent Iran from gaining power while the West is internally divided?
So it depends on which allies. So the United States has over 30 formal treaty allies, a lot of other security partners. So our allies and partners in the Middle East hated this deal. The countries that actually have to live in a region with Iran didn't like this deal. Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, Egypt, Jordan, thought this was a mistake. So they're delighted that the United States has pulled out. The Europeans are unhappy with the deal. And that is an issue, as Professor Koh pointed out. But I think Europe has never been, the European countries have never been leading states on non-proliferation issues, and they've often been problematic. So France, in the 1970s, the United States was trying to stop Taiwan and Pakistan from building nuclear weapons. France was selling them sensitive nuclear technology that would have allowed them to produce nuclear fuel. The United States had to play a leadership role and say, hey guys, cut it out, this is problematic. In the Obama administration, Obama was saying, hey, this Iran nuclear program is a problem, we need you guys to put tough sanctions on Iran to help us deal with it. And they didn't want to do that. It was only when it looked like the United States was going to have to use military force that they reluctantly agreed to sanctions because they thought military action would be even worse. So the situation we're in now, the Trump administration saying we have a strategy to solve this problem once and for all, hey, Europeans, come get on board, and them being a little skeptical, saying no, we'd rather buy cheap oil and gas from Iran, I think is kind of what we've seen over the past few decades with non-proliferation behavior between the United States and Europe. And it's the United States, I think, that has the bigger strategic picture, that sees the problem. And it's the Europeans who are being kind of petty, in my view, saying, no, we want to buy cheap oil and gas. So you guys figure out the nuclear stuff.
I'll go ahead and be argumentative.
Sure.
I think you're right about the Europeans. I mean, in general, the Europeans and most other countries around the world enjoy the benefits of the U.S. stopping the spread of nuclear weapons. But they like to avoid paying the costs. And maintaining sanctions against somebody who is willing to sell you oil at a reduced price is very expensive for their economies. So there's no question there's some free riding going on here. On the other hand, that has always been the case. And yet, nonetheless, the Europeans supported the desire of the United States to exert leverage over Iran when the deal was being negotiated. They were supportive of the sanctions. They were a key part of the pressure that was being exerted against Iran before the deal was made. And fundamentally, our ability to wield that pressure depends on their compliance with it. And so, if the Europeans say, I'm sorry, we're not willing to comply with this anymore, there's not much we can do about the fact that has reduced our bargaining power.
I think you came out to hear differing points of view, so this is the back and forth is good. One of the things that I really give the Obama administration credit for is their innovation in the sanctions space, and in particular, coming up with creative new so-called secondary sanctions. So one of the reasons the Obama administration was so successful at putting economic pressure on Iran were secondary sanctions. So by 1995, the United States and Iran had basically zero economic ties. The Clinton administration had cut off all direct trade and finance relationships between the United States and Iran. So when Iran started this program, the Bush administration wanted sanctions, Obama wanted sanctions. There wasn't really any room for the United States to ramp up its own sanctions. So what the Obama administration did was secondary sanctions. What they said is, we're mad at Iran, therefore if any other country or entity on earth does business with Iran, we'll sanction you. So European firms and businesses, Asian firms and businesses, European, Asian governments, if you do business with Iran, we'll sanction you. And if you do business with an entity that does business with Iran, we'll sanction you. Therefore, you have a choice. You can have an access to the largest market on earth, the US dollar, the US financial system, or you can buy cheap Iranian oil and gas. So for almost every government on earth, almost every major business on earth, it wasn't a choice at all. They had to cut off ties with Iran in order to maintain in the good graces of the United States Treasury. And so the Obama administration used quite a bit of coercion to force the Europeans and the Asians to come along with their sanctions regime. That's part of the reason they were successful. And that's part of the reason the Trump administration sanctions are successful. They've reinstated these secondary sanctions. And so even European governments are saying, we want to save the deal. European firms can't afford to do business with Iran anymore. They can't afford to lose access to the US market. So all major firms are pulling out of Iran. And even without the support of European governments, I think the Trump sanctions regime will have a big effect on Iran. And I think indeed we're already seeing that.
All right, well, on the subject of being argumentative, I will ask one slightly argumentative question. So, Professor Kroenig, you signed the now notorious letter in 2016 from Republican national security experts opposing the candidacy of Donald Trump. Obviously, he won. Since he's been in office, there's been, I think, unprecedented turnover in the upper echelons of his National Security Council. He's had 3 national security advisors. We talked about timing before. It seems that a big question here is that the status quo right now was, or I guess before the withdrawal, was the deal, and it was going to last us for 7 or 10 or however many years. Going against that seems to imply a certain faith that this particular administration, not just the U.S. generally, has the capability to navigate sort of a more complex post-deal world. Do you have that faith in the administration now?
So I think the administration has its problems for sure, including not staffing enough of these positions. I think the rhetoric is very unpredictable and unclear and hard to follow. But I also think that they're doing a better job than they're getting credit for, and I think that some of their policies and strategies are actually done pretty well. So the basic strategy was put in place. Started with H.R. McMaster, who I think many people thought was an effective national security advisor. And the basic approach is one that the United States has used essentially over and over again for dealing with rogue states pursuing nuclear programs. So the Obama administration called its approach to Iran a dual-track approach of pressure and engagement, increased the economic, political, military pressure on Iran as long as it pursued a nuclear program, but promise engagement, sanctions relief, an improvement of relationships if they're willing to give that up. The Trump administration came in, North Korea. They call their North Korea policy maximum pressure and engagement, increase the economic, political, military pressure on North Korea so long as they're pursuing this program, but hold open the possibility of diplomacy, which we now see them pursuing. So the approach to Iran is, I think by this point, pretty well worn. It's to increase the pressure on Iran through sanctions, but holding out the possibility for negotiations if Iran's willing to come and negotiate a better deal. So I think the model is pretty straightforward, and I think we see the administration implementing that.
Not to encourage a political argument, but do you have another opinion on that, Professor Koh?
I mean, I agree that whatever one thinks of the messages that emanate from the White House, there are highly competent people working for the Trump administration who are doing their best to pursue U.S. interests abroad. But we've seen there are harsh limits on their ability to do that, in part because of exactly what's coming out of the White House. So I profess to having less faith that this administration will pursue this strategy with sufficient competence to maximize its chances of succeeding. It may succeed nonetheless. They may get lucky. And it may be that even a highly competent administration wouldn't be able to pull this off. But I do have my doubts, given the leadership of the moment.
I feel a tiny bit safer hearing your confidence in the adults in the room, as I think they've been called. So I think the plan now is to go to questions from the audience.
The question is, how do you think that the United States pulling out of this deal, or pulling out of the deal, will affect the United States' ability to make deals in the future with other countries if other countries see that a change in administration could lead to just a significant shift from significant difference between different administrations about or a policy, not necessarily just for nuclear weapons for other countries, but just in general? How do you think that will affect our ability to shift?
I think it's a serious issue. It's often been the case that these agreements the United States makes with regimes to stop their pursuit of nuclear weapons are controversial. They often, there's not a consensus that this was better than the alternative or that this was the best deal that could have been had. It is more unusual for the United States to make a deal and then quite rapidly renege on it. There has been some commentary from other regimes around the world that are not friendly with the United States to the effect of the clear lesson to draw here is that you can't trust the US's deal in negotiations. You could make an agreement and then very soon thereafter the concessions, you did your part and the concessions weren't forthcoming. So I think that's a serious cost. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing, but it's something that has to weigh on the side of not doing it.
So I agree there's a cost. I'd just make a few points. So one, Professor Koh said these agreements are often controversial, and indeed the North Korea nuclear agreement that Clinton had in '94 was controversial. One non-proliferation agreement that wasn't controversial, though, was the agreement with Libya in 2003. And it wasn't controversial because we sent over cargo ships and cargo planes. They put their enrichment program in boxes, and we flew it back to nuclear labs in the United States and took care of the program. So if you get a deal like that, it's not controversial. The reason this deal was controversial is because, in my view, because there were problems with it. And let's remember that there was bipartisan opposition to the deal. Every Republican in Congress opposed the deal, and several Democrats opposed the deal. So there was only partisan Democratic support for the Obama administration's deal. And so I think there is a cost to pulling out, but I think one lesson is the Obama administration shouldn't have cut a deal of that magnitude without broader support. And so I think one of the lessons that may actually increase U.S. credibility is that a future U.S. negotiator can go and to the North Koreans or to the Iranians or whoever and say, look, this thing might fall apart in a couple of months, a couple of years, unless you give me something that I can sell back home. If I can't get Congress on board, if I can't get the American people on board, this isn't going to work. So you're going to have to give me some real concessions that that can help me make the case.
I'd like to say something to that, actually. I guess it depends on how you view the current state of our politics, but given the hyperpolarization, the gridlock that characterizes Congress, it's not that easy for me to imagine a deal that the Obama administration could have made that would have received full-throated support from Republicans in Congress. So, I mean, I guess I have my doubts that that was even on the table. And hence that, the idea was like, whatever deal is going to come out, it's not going to get a lot of Republican support. But I could be wrong about that.
Yeah. I mean, Republicans supported the killing of bin Laden. They didn't say that was a mistake or done poorly. So you have a good point, but I also think if the deal was good enough, there was nothing Republicans could have said.
Well, sure. I mean, if you give them like apple pie too, then they're happy. But like the U.S. doesn't have complete, it's not dominant over Iran. So there was inevitably going to be some compromises in the deal, and it's a fair argument to say whether the compromises that were made were overly generous to Iran. But I don't think a deal was on the table. I can't imagine that Iran would have accepted a deal that Republicans would not have been able to find something to attack about it.
Please comment on Israel's nuclear program and the U.S.'s stance to that, and why do we sort of see an exception to the U.S.'s general policy of nuclear non-proliferation in this case in specific?
Well, so the United States tried to stop Israel from building nuclear weapons. So many people assume that the United States helped Israel build nuclear weapons or that we turned a blind eye. In fact, it was the French who helped Israel build nuclear weapons. They started with a secret nuclear program in 1958. When we first got wind of it, 60, 61, the Kennedy administration was very concerned about this, took action, including imposing a series of inspections on Israel to try to stop Israel from building nuclear weapons. Israel basically kind of lied to the United States and hid this secret nuclear program from us. And then so by the time the Nixon administration came in the late 1960s, they realized that we were too late, that Israel had succeeded in building this secret nuclear program. So then we had this problem of what to do about it. We were worried that if Israel kind of tested nuclear weapons or came forward with its nuclear program, that might lead to widespread proliferation in the Middle East. So we essentially cut this deal with them where we said, it's too late, we can't put the genie back in the bottle, but you need to keep this program under wraps. And so that's been the status quo to the present, that Israel has this opaque nuclear capability. Basically, everybody assumes that they have it, but Israel hasn't formally announced that they have it. So in my view, it would be wonderful if we could get Israel to give up nuclear weapons. But I think they've had the program for decades. They have, according to unclassified estimates, dozens, maybe 100 or more nuclear weapons. So putting the genie back in the bottle is going to be difficult. What's interesting is Israel's program over all these decades hasn't led to other countries in the region building nuclear weapons in response. Iran's program has started to do that. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates have started civilian nuclear programs that many people see as a cover for a nuclear weapons program. Saudi Arabia has said whatever capabilities Iran has, they will match. So it does seem to be the case that Iran's nuclear program is causing much more discomfort in the region than Israel's nuclear program ever did.
Professor Kroenig, I think you mentioned that the Middle East was happy about it pulling out of the deal. But then Professor Kroenig also mentioned that there's this danger of Iran actually transferring this nuclear information of producing nuclear weapons to other Middle Eastern states which are in proximity. So then there's the possibility of other Middle Eastern states actually benefiting from the nuclear success in Iran. So how much weightage and can we give to this Middle Eastern support for pulling out of the deal, since they would actually benefit from nuclear success in Iran?
So I think the real risk of Iran transferring nuclear technology wouldn't be in the region. I think it would be outside of the region. So several years ago, Iran signed a nuclear cooperation agreement with Venezuela. Iran, Russia, and China have all tried to prop up the regime, the Maduro regime in Venezuela. So I think it's unlikely that Venezuela will build nuclear weapons anytime soon. They've got a lot of other serious issues they're dealing with. But I think it's a situation like that I would worry about more. I don't think Iran would transfer nuclear technology in the region because that would be a problem for Iran itself. I think Iran would like to maintain a nuclear monopoly. So I don't think that countries in the region are benefiting from Iran somehow being strengthened by the deal. I think it's the opposite. They were afraid that the deal strengthened Iran. It provided Iran with this influx of cash that it's been using to fund proxy and other groups throughout the region. Saudi Arabia, others have seen this as a threat. And so they're hopeful that now that we're out of the deal, we can increase the economic pressure on Iran. We can begin to push back on Iran's malign influence throughout the region. Because one of the other downsides of the deal, it wasn't explicitly part of the deal, but the Obama administration in particular was very reluctant to push back against Iran in areas that weren't even covered in the deal, just because they were afraid by getting tough with Iran in other areas that maybe that would lead Iran to pull out of the deal. So now that we're out of the deal, the United States should have more leeway to go after Iran in Syria and other places. So I think that's why Middle Eastern states support pulling out of the deal, not because it makes Iran stronger and them stronger, but the opposite, that it would weaken Iran and make Iran less of a threat to them.
Yeah, so my question is fairly similar to the first question about American credibility with pulling out of this deal. But so one of the things, I guess, if you think in the more long term, one of the greater threats to U.S. power is the potential rise of China as a global superpower. So one of my questions is, one of the things that people have said, well, the U.S. is probably okay because we have strong international ties, we can cooperate with Europe and so on, and that kind of can hedge against the potential rise of China. Do you think that, I guess this is more directed to Professor Kroenig, but do you think that pulling out of the Iranian deal and reinstating secondary sanctions threatens to alienate the European allies and accelerate the rise of China?
I don't. So this is a difference of opinion with Europe about how to deal with Iran, but we've had these kind of differences before. They didn't support going to war in Iraq in 2003. They didn't support the Vietnam War. Go all the way back to 1956 when they were the aggressor and we didn't support that action. So we've had major policy differences before. But there's a lot bringing us together with our allies in Europe and Asia. We have shared values, major economic relationships with each other, formal treaty allies through NATO, and we share some of the same threats from a rise of China. So a lot of attention has been focused on the trade war between the United States and China, but Europe and Japan have also spoken out formal statements against China's unfair trade practices, formal concerns about China taking contested territory from treaty allies. So short answer, I think, is this doesn't help, but I think there's a lot of other things bringing our alliances together, and still many shared concerns with how to deal with China, Russia, North Korea that will continue to bring us together.
Yeah, so I have a question about the, let's say, worst case scenario here in the situation where Iran has developed the bomb and the U.S. military has correspondingly invaded. Do you think the greatest risk there goes against a tactical nuclear military strike against something like a carrier battle group? Or do you think it'd be more likely they would target a civilian, target like a city? And in that case, in the case they do develop it, the number of warheads they would have would virtually guarantee their destruction by the U.S. if they engage a civilian target. My question is, what's the likelihood of the use on a military target versus a civilian one should Iran get the bomb?
I mean, I guess my view is that if we're in some future scenario where Iran has acquired nuclear weapons, the most likely outcome by far is that Iran never uses nuclear weapons. If there's some war between the United States and Iran, let's say over some disputed piece of territory somewhere else, or competing interventions in a civil war in the region, part of the problem with Iran having nuclear weapons is that because the U.S. doesn't want to put Iran in a position where it feels like it has to use a nuclear weapon, the United States is going to be much more restrained in the force it brings to bear in those situations. So, we might intervene to rescue an ally or eliminate a regime that Iran had installed that was hostile to the United States, but we're going to do so in a way that makes clear to Iran that our interest here is limited. We're not seeking an opportunity to overthrow Iran's regime. We're simply looking to restore the status quo or maintain the status quo and continue living with this adversarial regime in Iran. Like that in some sense is the real worry. It's not that Iran's going to use, if Iran gets nuclear weapons, it's going to use them. That's very unlikely. The worry is that simply by having them, they're going to cause the United States and its allies in the region to be much more cautious in how they deal with Iran and to be much less willing to apply these pressures on Iran. And as a result, Iran is going to get more of its way in the region.
Do you think, what would the response be if Iran did use it not on a civilian target, but on a military one, where there was limited civilian casualties? Do you think that would ensure a mad response if they use it on a military target?
I can jump in here unless you want to. So I think your question raises two issues for me. So one, it's why it's important to stop Iran from getting nuclear weapons, so we don't have to worry about these terrible scenarios of Iran using nuclear weapons and how would they use them. So that's why I think a policy of prevention that Obama and Trump and Bush before them supported is the right one. If Iran got nuclear weapons, what would its strategy look like? It's an interesting question you'd have to think into the future. I mean, I think one pattern we've seen is that often conventionally weaker powers have relied on threats of early use of nuclear weapons as a way to try to offset the conventional superiority of their adversaries. So Pakistan does that today with India, saying that if India invades, they'll use tactical nuclear weapons. Russia has this escalate to de-escalate strategy, which is basically a threat to use nuclear weapons early in a conflict with NATO in the hope that they could frighten NATO into backing down. We're not quite sure what North Korea's nuclear strategy is, but many people suspect that facing a conventionally superior United States, they might also have incentives to use nuclear weapons early. So if you think about that with Iran and the United States, I think there is a case to be made that Iran would have an incentive to develop a nuclear strategy that calls for threats to use nuclear weapons early, maybe even limited nuclear use early on against a carrier battle group or something like that. The U.S. response, I think we can learn something by looking at the U.S. strategy for Russia and North Korea. So we think both of them have limited nuclear response strategies. Our response to North Korea is to say if you use a nuclear weapon, it'll be the last thing you ever do. It'll be the end of the Kim regime because it's a weaker state and we can credibly threaten that. With Russia, we've basically said if you use a few nuclear weapons, we'll use a few nuclear weapons. So it's trying to deter limited nuclear war with limited nuclear war, because we know the threat of mutually assured destruction is not really credible with Russia. It would mean suicide for the United States. So I think Iran is more in the category of North Korea than Russia. I suspect our strategy would be to say, use a single nuclear weapon and it'll be the last thing you ever do.
So I've heard the argument that if the Iranian deal were allowed to continue until its end, it would result in a strengthened Iranian economy as a result of the sanctions relief, which would both give them a stronger position at the negotiating table and also make it more difficult or make it easier for them to gain nuclear weapons if they were to decide to do so. So why do you think that it would be a better option for that to occur than for the United States to pull out of the deal now and try to negotiate a deal before they've fully strengthened their economy?
The reason I think that is that, first of all, it's already within Iran's grasp to get a nuclear weapon. Whether its economy increases in the future is going to have no impact on its ability to get a nuclear weapon because it was already on the brink. Right? Apparently, its economy, however bad it is today, is still good enough to produce the revenue needed to make a nuclear weapon. The second thing is that to the extent that Iran's economy gets stronger because of dropped sanctions, if some point comes in the future where the United States and the rest of the international community decide to sanction Iran again, they're going to find those sanctions more painful precisely because Iran has established more commercial links, has more investment with the outside world. Their economy is going to be more dependent, not less, on outside commerce. So I actually think letting Iran establish trade relationships, investment relationships with outside countries helps them in the short run, but in the long run actually makes them more vulnerable to international pressure.
The U.S. reimposed sanctions, which then Europe, you said, was then trying to provide more provisions to kind of counter these sanctions. But then the U.S. has also imposed those secondary sanctions, which makes it hard for Europe to do that. And then you said that Iran now is already starting to feel these effects. But when the effects are being felt, it's more often going to be by the day-to-day people rather than the governmental elites. So then my question is there a case for moral and ethics here? And how would you defend pulling out of the deal on a more ethical standpoint? Or is the risk of nuclear war much more dangerous that you don't even consider ethics in this scenario because nuclear war is more devastating?
Yeah, a couple of comments on that. One, the biggest, I think, cause of suffering for the Iranian people is the Iranian government. And they're doing a good job of abusing the human rights of their people, mismanaging the economy. And so the sanctions are only effective because the economy is so poorly mismanaged in the first place. But in addition, I think that the United States has been, for all of its faults and all of its mistakes in foreign policy, it's basically created the world that we know today. After 1945, the United States and its allies won World War II, and we created the international system we know today, the rules-based international order, U.S.-led international order, many call it. But we created the UN, the NATO, the IMF, the institutions that govern the international system. We encourage democracy in our spheres of influence. We often forget Europe and Asia don't have a long history of democracy. Over the past 70 years, they've become much more democratic, I think in large part because of America's influence. The United States has promoted this open trading system that's led to levels of prosperity we haven't seen in human history. And the United States military has provided security in Europe and in Asia and in the Middle East. Again, not always perfectly, but we've had stability, especially in Europe and Asia, that we've never seen historically. And so I think stopping other countries from building nuclear weapons is an important part of this kind of rules-based international order. And so, I think that stopping Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, stopping an arms race in the Middle East, stopping countries from using nuclear weapons is the moral imperative here. And it requires some serious, and difficult choices, but objective.
This question is mainly for you, Professor Kroenig. I was watching a lecture you were giving at Berkeley a few years ago, back when you were talking reasons not to support the bill, the deal. And one of the better arguments I thought you made was the idea that these snapback sanctions won't be as effective as the Obama administration was claiming. You're saying that these sanctions, the power behind them has been built up over years, and once you eliminate them, it's not that easy to just reimpose them in these so-called snapback sanctions. Deals with companies are made, and it's kind of hard to undo those once they've started. And it would seem to me that it would logically follow then that once you've established the deal, it wouldn't make too much sense to then pull out, or at least that you were talking about these secondary sanctions that the Trump administration has proposed. They have been effective, and the new regime of sanctions is strong, but in a way we have lost a lot of leverage. And a few of us here at Lafayette were talking to Tom Nichols last year, and I think this is a general, a pretty strongly held view, especially security, national security people on the right, that yes, the deal was bad, but once we're in it, it doesn't make much sense to leave it. We've lost our leverage, so it's better to have something rather than nothing. So I was kind of wondering what you think is flawed about that view, or what exactly people that hold that view are missing, and that we should have removed ourselves.
Well, first point I'd make is signing this deal, pulling out, trying to get another one is clearly not the ideal approach. In my view, the better approach would have been to never sign this deal in the first place, to keep the economic pressure in place and to push until we get an acceptable deal. But that's not what we did. We did sign the deal, and so given that we're stuck in this bad situation with this bad deal, then how do you handle it? And so one option would be waiting 10 or 15 years for the deal to expire and then try to renegotiate it. And that's what some Obama administration officials said when pressed, what do you do in 10 to 15 years? They said, well, we'll just deal with it then. But I think we'd be in a weaker position then for a variety of reasons. So I have a little bit of a different take from this discussion that happened previously, because I think if Iran's economy recovers for 10 to 15 years, then it's in a better position to withstand the reimposition of sanctions. It's working from a stronger base. And then in addition, as I said, I think you would have then more foreign companies with a stronger interest in Iran that would make them more reluctant to pull out. So one of the things I also argued, maybe not in the Berkeley talk, but I have argued before, is that so if we're going to pull out, it makes more sense to do it immediately rather than 15 years from now. So I think it would have been better not to sign the deal in the first place, but given that we signed it, I think pulling out early is better than trying to renegotiate 15 years from now.
So I don't understand that point of view. I mean, genuinely I don't. So what's going to happen in 10 to 15 years is the limits start expiring. And then one of two things is going to happen. Either Iran is going to continue obeying those limits even though they've expired, in which case it will be difficult for the U.S. to come up with rationale for doing exactly what it's doing right now, like threatening to pull out and trying to renegotiate the deal. Or Iran will start taking advantage of the lapse of those limits, and the United States will have a perfect reason for going back to the table and saying, listen, this is not acceptable. It wasn't acceptable 10 years ago. It's not acceptable now. And, Iran, in starting this dangerous behavior again, will be giving the U.S. all the support it needs in the international community to build leverage again. So, why is it that it makes sense to do this in a time when, to the rest of the world, it looks like Iran was doing its part, and instead it's just that this guy they don't like happened to win the election and is doing this thing, and now they can blame it on the United States?
So I think the difference is what do you judge as the relative negotiating leverage of the United States versus Iran today versus what it would be 15 years from now. And so, of course, we don't know what it would be 15 years from now. But my assumption would be that with 15 years in the deal, Iran will be in a stronger position. Its economy will have recovered. It will militarily likely be stronger. And so I think our ability to, yes, we can make the case their nuclear program is a problem, although that's not even clear if they start to expand their enrichment program. We can say, look, they're expanding their enrichment program, they're trying to build nuclear weapons, and the Iranians will say, no, we've abided by these limits for 15 years, we've done our part, we can now have an industrial scale enrichment program for peaceful purposes. I think many Europeans would say, yeah, they've played by the rules for 15 years, that they've got a kind of get out of jail free card now, they can do what they want. So I think it would be very hard for the United States to make the case 15 years from now that that their program is a problem if they've been abiding by it for 15 years.
Well, I'd like to, just have one more attempt at encouraging a little more argument, but one of the criticisms of, I guess especially of John Bolton, which has been expressed in the editorial pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post, is that him and his allies are focused primarily on regime change, and the opposition to the deal is sort of pro forma. They don't really care about the technical details. So I guess the question for both of you, or either, is do you think that Bolton is insistent upon regime change, and do you think that's a good or even viable idea?
So I think to some degree the regime destabilizing levels of pressure is necessary to get a deal. And I think that's why we got the first deal. I think the Supreme Leader was beginning to worry about the stability of the regime given the economic and international pressure they were under. And so he and Rouhani were looking for an escape hatch that they got in the deal. So I think if we're going to get a better deal, that it is going to require tough pressure against Iran, and it's probably going to require levels of pressure that are so severe that the Supreme Leader fears that maybe his hold on power is unstable. So I see those two things as somewhat linked.
And you don't think that's a difficult negotiating position to take, to say that we're going to, almost by definition, threaten your existence, and we want to bring you to the table by, threatening to have you overthrown?
Well, I think if the U.S. position is we're going to overthrow you either way, then they have no incentive to comply. If we say we're going to make your life very difficult as long as you keep this enrichment program, but if you're willing to give it up, we're willing to let that pressure off, then I think that can be an effective negotiating approach.
So I have a more argumentative question, if I may. So, Matt, a few years ago, you wrote, I think, 2 articles at different points in time, somewhere around 2012, and then a book arguing that the best option for the United States, at least at the time, was to attack Iran, go to war with Iran, solve the problem permanently. And a few years later, your mind has apparently changed. You favor making a deal, just not the deal that we actually have, a better deal that may or may not be possible to make because Iran may or may not be willing to make that kind of concession. So I guess my question is, how has your thinking on the attractiveness of war as the solution to this problem changed over time, and why?
Well, I see you may not have read my book, just the title, because the title of the book and the articles are provocative, and the editors wanted provocative titles. But if you read the book, it says explicitly that the ideal solution is diplomacy. And I go through some of these diplomatic options and weigh the cost and benefits. But the big question we were dealing with in 2012 was what happens if diplomacy fails? It looks like we weren't making progress at all, and so serious people had to wrestle with the issue. Diplomacy fails, we're faced with this terrible choice of living with a nuclear-armed Iran or taking military action. What is worse? And that's an issue. I took a year leave from Georgetown University and spent a year on the Iran desk in DoD working on precisely this issue. What does a strike against Iran's nuclear facilities look like? How would they retaliate? How would we protect ourselves and respond? What does a nuclear-armed Iran look like? What are the threats? What's a deterrence and containment regime for dealing with that? And there are 2 bad options, but in my judgment, limited strike was less bad than living with the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran forever. And I think it was controversial at the time, but I think it's a judgment that's fairly widely shared now. President Obama explicitly said that he'd be willing to use force if necessary to stop Iran. There's a bipartisan consensus that the military option needs to be on the table. So my thinking hasn't changed at all. I've always thought a good deal is the best solution. I still think that if diplomacy fails and we're faced with this terrible choice, that doing what it takes, including use military force, is better than a nuclear Iran.
I haven't heard any thinking about or any insight with regard to Israel's reaction. I would think that would be the greatest threat and the greatest reaction to Iran getting a nuclear bomb. Do you have a position on Israel's insight?
So, one of the reasons a nuclear-armed Iran would be dangerous, I think, is because of what the Iran-Israel nuclear balance might look like. During the Cold War, we had kind of mutual nuclear deterrence with the Soviet Union, and we came close to nuclear war several times, Cuban Missile Crisis and some others. But there were actually many sources of stability. Both sides had kind of robust nuclear postures that could absorb a nuclear attack. It would have taken 30 minutes for missiles to travel between the two countries, which gave us a little bit of time for kind of decision-making in a crisis. There was a hotline established after the Cuban Missile Crisis that allowed direct conversation between the leaders. If you think about a future nuclear-armed Iran with a nuclear-armed Israel, I think many of those sources of stability are absent. Both are relatively small countries, both would have relatively small arsenals, so there may be first strike incentives that would be destabilizing. It would take several minutes for missiles to travel back and forth between the two countries, not 30 minutes, which compresses the time for decision-making. And presently, there's no direct channel of communication between Iran and Israel. So I think that nuclear balance of power would be very unstable, and there would be a real risk of nuclear conflict. So I think that's one reason to want to stop Iran. The other place Israel comes in is what happens if diplomacy does fail, Iran's marching to build nuclear weapons, and Trump or whoever the US president is says, I'm not willing to do anything about it, I'm not getting into a war in the Middle East. Then at that point, I think Israel likely would try to take military action on its own. I think Israel would much prefer that the United States do it because our capabilities are much better. And if it came to that point, I would prefer that the United States do it as well. Our capabilities are better both to destroy the program and to deal with retaliation. But if it came to that point, America wasn't willing to do anything about it. I think Israel would do its best to destroy Iran's program, knowing full well that their option's not nearly as effective as America's.
It was mentioned that there were some 12 points, like objections of negotiations that Trump had, such as getting rid of the sunset clause and also the temporariness of it. But then after speaking to Europe, they did, it was decided that it was pushing it too much and getting rid of too many of the concessions that were made to Iran. But so then, what standpoint is the U.S. going to take now? Does Trump actually stand at that inclination towards using military intervention when it comes to that point? Because there is a sort of timeline that Iran will ultimately end up making a weapon. So if a new deal is not possible because the points that Trump wants is not going to happen, how else are we going to deal with this problem?
So currently, Iran is continuing to abide by the limits set out in the deal. So even the United States has said it's pulling out. Iran hasn't started ramping up its nuclear program yet. So I said that they're 12 months away if they make a dash for it. That clock hasn't started ticking yet. So right now the United States is essentially having its cake and eating it too. Iran isn't ramping up its program, but we're ramping up the sanctions pressure. If Iran decides, for whatever reason, to contravene those limits, then the clock starts ticking. Then that's when things would get interesting. We'd essentially be back to the kind of game of chicken we were in 2012 or 2013 or so. And if it came to that point where Iran was on the verge of a nuclear breakout, how would Trump respond? I don't know. On one hand, he seemed to be willing to use force in Syria against Assad, in a place where Obama was unwilling to do it. On the other hand, Trump has also made a bunch of comments about our dumb wars in the Middle East, and it doesn't seem like he's eager to use military force. So
you're saying Trump is erratic? I mean, I would also say it's worth pointing out that if Iran decided to do that and that 12-month clock starts ticking, we would be almost certain to know about it. And the reason we would be almost certain to know about it is exactly the deal. The deal came with all of these extraordinarily intrusive monitoring measures. In fact, some of the most intrusive measures any country's ever agreed to as part of a non-proliferation deal, which are designed to ensure to a very high standard that the United States will know almost immediately if Iran begins to violate the limits of the agreement.
You both have talked extensively about the importance of having a credible limited strike option against Iran, should we need to intervene if they're about to acquire the bomb. And I know you in particular, Professor Coe, expressed concern about our ability to do that back when the deal was signed because we were bogged down in Iraq and this in the Middle East. So apologies if this isn't provocative enough for Daniel. But if you were to give you each the keys to the White House for the next 7 to 12 years, what steps would you take to ensure that we had the best opportunity to contain a potentially nuclear Iran when the deal expires, assuming it holds together for the next 7 to 12 years?
No one in their right mind should give either of us the keys to the White House. Maybe Matt differs on this, but certainly not me. My feeling was that the optimal path forward for the United States was to hold Iran to the deal to the extent possible, use the monitoring mechanisms built in to be sure that Iran actually was living by the limits, and then as the expiration of those limits expire, begin the negotiations to do something about that. Extend them for another 10 years, make them permanent, potentially alter other aspects of the deal. And my impression is that that was the Obama administration's hope as well, that this is the way this is going to work out. We've kicked the can down the road, but the problem's not getting any worse as a result of this. And as a result, the United States will be in no worse position in 10 years than it is today.
So I want to make sure I understood. So you're saying it was basically about the U.S. military option and what should we do to make sure we have the military capability to deal with Iran's program. So I think there were several aspects, but I think that was one aspect. Past several secretaries of defense have made it very clear that we have the ability to deal with Iran's program today. So it's a big problem, but it's really 4 buildings. All this is over 4 buildings. It's uranium enrichment facility at Natanz, uranium enrichment facility at Qom, an above-ground reactor at Iraq. Well, really now it's 3 problems because they did shut down the reactor at Iraq as part of the deal. So I wouldn't argue that the deal didn't accomplish anything, it just didn't accomplish enough in my view. And then they have this uranium conversion facility at Esfahan. So if you take out those 3 facilities, you've dealt a pretty serious blow to Iran's nuclear program. The United States knows where those facilities are. It has the ability to destroy them. 2 of them are underground. One of them is built into the side of a mountain. And so some have said, oh, well, that's a really difficult military target. But Ash Carter, Obama's Secretary of Defense, and others have said we have the ability to destroy those facilities.
I should also note that it's been pointed out by military experts that the deal itself, because of the access that inspectors were given to these facilities, it's actually gotten easier for the United States to target them accurately as a result, because we know more about the design of those facilities than we did before.
There's been a lot of talk about how the U.S. may be alienating itself from the other P5+1 members and sort of charting its own course. Is there a single country that is sort of key to keeping the rest of the world together on this? Like, is there a nation that will really deviate from this, that is more friendly to Iran after our withdrawal?
I mean, I think countries vary in exactly how much of a threat they perceive from Iran and exactly the costs they suffer as the result of either the U.S. maintaining the deal or the U.S. pulling out of it. So, part of the reason why our allies in the Middle East didn't like the deal is because ultimately it's them that suffer the costs of the U.S. Relaxing sanctions on Iran and Iran engaging in more mischief in the region. The Europeans don't care as much about that because it's not going to happen to them. China and Russia, frankly, were never super enthusiastic about putting a lot of pressure on Iran. They remain unenthusiastic about it today. In the past, they have proven the biggest challenge for assembling an international consensus to apply pressure to some proliferant, and that would probably be true again in the future.
Well, to answer the first part of your question, you said, is there one country that's the key to the future of this? And I'd say it's the United States.
Given that President Trump is the first U.S. president without a background in politics, who was responsible for influencing his decision on, 1, wanting to renegotiate the deal, and 2, eventually pulling out of it?
I mean, I'll speculate wildly about what's going on inside Trump's head. I'm guessing there are 2 factors going on. One is that the bulk of the Republican Party opposed quite strongly the deal. As a result, President Trump is in fact the leader of the Republican Party at the moment. His party is quite against the deal, so he might take that as reason enough to pull out of the deal. But the second one is that there are people out there, Matt's not alone, making the argument that the deal is bad, or rather has flaws. Most people agree on that, and that those flaws are sufficiently bad that this is the right thing to do. And so, one could surmise that those arguments have been persuasive.
I agree, and I'd add a few points. One, I think one of the reasons that the other Republican candidates said we're going to pull out on day 1, and Trump said I'm going to renegotiate it, is that Trump thinks he's the master negotiator, given his business experience and other things. So I think that's part of what was driving him, that I think he really believes he could get a better deal, whereas I'm not sure that Rubio or Walker or others would have been in search of a better deal. I think Trump really is in search of a better deal. Second issue, they tried this different approach in the first year, which was to try to get the Europeans on board with our criticisms. And then they couldn't get the Europeans on board with that, partially, but not all the way. And so I think that's part of the reason for trying a different approach. And then third, you did have the change in personnel with McMaster leaving and Bolton coming in. And Bolton had been one of the most critical of the deal, one of the people arguing that we need to get out right away. And so maybe he also was influential in Trump's decision.
Another question was, is there any debate over whether Iran wants a bomb? Or does everyone just assume that they do? They still do?
I mean, I think Iran is highly responsive to the incentives and the environment it faces. The suspicion prior to the deal was that all of this stuff they were doing was ambiguous, objectively, but there was every reason to think there was no point in them doing this and suffering the penalties that came with it unless they were hoping to get a weapon out of it. As far as we know, they ceased the parts of the program that are unambiguously about turning nuclear technology into a weapon in 2003. That's probably not coincidental with the fact that the United States invaded Iraq explicitly to end its WMD programs at that same time. We now have this trove of documents that the Israeli intelligence services captured or allegedly captured in Iran, which I believe, and which show unambiguously that Iran was doing nuclear research that is only useful for weapons. So I don't think there's any question that the Iranians wanted the bomb, that they were willing to complete the program, but that they were going to be responsive to the reactions that brought from the international community.
I agree.
Is there any daylight between you two on the effectiveness, the hypothetical effectiveness of the snapback provisions, or do you agree with each other on how effective that part of the deal would have been?
Well, I'm actually confused because Matt has made the argument that the snapback sanctions might not work as well as the Obama administration was hoping and advertising, and I agree with that. Like, once you let sanctions down, it's not always easy to get all of the people who need to say yes to put them back up to say yes again, regardless of what the deal said or whatever the architecture was. But on the other hand, you've made the argument that, in fact, they have snapped back, and in fact, that happened even though the rest of the world didn't support it. Simply the U.S. deciding that it was going to happen was enough to make it happen.
Yeah, so this is one area where I've been surprised, and I think a lot of people have been surprised at how effective the Trump administration's unilateral withdrawal from the deal and threat to reimpose sanctions has been. How effective it's been in getting the Europeans to pull out, how effective it's been on the Iranian economy. There's been hyperinflation of the rial. So I did criticize snapback sanctions. I thought it wouldn't work as effective as advertised, but I'm pleasantly surprised. I think part of it may be a little bit like the itsy bitsy spider. If you know, I have a 2-year-old daughter, but I think Iran had been hunkering down under the sanctions for so long, and then it finally got the deal, and it kind of opened up to the sunlight and said, okay, and then suddenly another downpour with the U.S. suddenly reimposing sanctions, I think caught them off guard to some degree. But yeah, I have been surprised at how effective the reimposition of U.S. sanctions have been.
You mentioned Netanyahu's discussion of the Israeli obtained intelligence. Depending on what news source you use, there's some question about whether that intelligence merely confirmed that Iran was seeking a nuclear weapon before the deal, or whether it was in fact in violation of the deal after the fact. Can either of you say something about that?
My understanding is that all of the documents that were recovered date from before, not only before the deal was made, but in fact before the intelligence community of the United States estimated that Iran had stopped the clear weaponization aspects of its program in 2003.
Do you agree with that? I agree with that. And going back to Professor Van Dijk's question, there is some question about why hold on to that stuff if you've made a strategic decision to give up your program altogether. And so I think that's only one small piece of a broader body of evidence that suggests that I don't think Iran has completely given up its nuclear ambition. I think it made a tactical decision to stop the program to temporarily relieve pressure, but it was clearly keeping the option to go back open.
But do you think it was in compliance with the deal?
I do, and so this is an important point actually, because many critics of Trump's decision to pull out have said everybody agrees Iran's complying with the deal, yet Trump's pulling out. This makes no sense. And so they're missing the point. The criticism isn't that Iran's cheating on the deal. The criticism is it's a bad deal. And so if it's a bad deal, it doesn't matter that Iran's complying. If I sign a deal that says you can beat me up every day, and we say you're complying with the deal, does that mean I shouldn't get out of the deal? So, silly example, I guess. But the criticism wasn't that Iran's not complying. The criticism was the terms of the deal itself are not in the U.S. interest.
Because I know there was a fair amount of effort to portray Iran as, I think, in compliance with the letter, but not the spirit of the deal. But you don't think that gets at the heart of the reason for withdrawal?
No, I think spirit of the deal arguments are arguments that people make when they wish they'd negotiated a better deal.
Okay.
Because what does spirit of the deal mean? It means, when you negotiate an international treaty, there are things that are clearly stipulated as part of the deal and things that are excluded. If it's excluded, then it's not violating the deal to do those things. And so both sides made arguments that this side or the other's violating the spirit of the deal.
Okay.
But I think that means you're doing things you don't like that are not covered in the deal.
Here, the room mic cut out, but Professors Kroenig and Co. were asked how likely regime change in Iran is, what form regime change might take if it occurs, and to what extent U.S. pressure raises the likelihood of regime change.
So I think there are those who argue that, so it seems the majority opinion in the United States that we'd all like Iran's regime to change, whether it happened internally, or whether it happened because of some stimulus from the United States. We could imagine a regime that we would get along with a lot better and that would treat its people a lot better. There's disagreement about exactly what's likely to make that happen. There are those who think that the way to make that happen is to impose sanctions and to make the sanctions as severe as possible, because by doing so, you're effectively sending a signal to the Iranian people that if you want to have a functioning economy, you're going to have to get rid of this government because this government hasn't been able to satisfy the United States and the international community. There are others who think that the way to change the regime is by engaging with it, allowing it to develop its economy, and hoping that as the economy changes, the willingness of the Iranian people to tolerate the regime will change, and they will exert change themselves. I have to say I'm extraordinarily skeptical of any claim that one could predict with any confidence which one of those theories is right or whether either of them would ever lead to regime change. We simply do not know enough about exactly where the tolerance level of the Iranian public is and exactly how far the Iranian regime is willing to go to stay in power. We know they're willing to kill substantial numbers of their own people, but we don't know that, say, if the groups of people in Iran who have traditionally been more supportive of the regime turned against it, whether the regime and its security units would be willing to kill those people. So I have to admit that I don't think we know. I think we're guessing about what might stimulate regime change in Iran or not, and I'm skeptical of any prediction.
Maybe just one other thing to add, a minor point, but one thing that's interesting is that right after we signed the deal, there was a decline in oil prices, and so hypothetically, if we had stayed on the pressure track and the Iranians were getting less for their exports, they could have been in a very vulnerable position, maybe in such a vulnerable position that they would have been desperate enough to give up enrichment altogether. But it's a hypothetical. We don't know.
A lot of revolutionary regimes, after a few generations pass, they just mature into normal nation states. And the Iranian Revolution is pretty recent. Is there, is there a sense of, at what point one could reasonably expect Iran to maybe behave in a more just normal nation state way? 10 years probably isn't enough, but I don't know, 2 more generations? I don't know.
Well, Kissinger famously said the Iranian government needs to decide if it's a nation or a cause. And so he said that several decades ago, and I think the question still holds today. Does it want to be a regular nation state, or is it a cause? I mean, one interesting variable coming up is the Supreme Leader's 79, I believe. And so what happens when he dies? Formally what would happen is the other clerics would get together and elect a new Supreme Leader. But could that be kind of an inflection point that leads to a rallying for some kind of uprising or something? Would the leaderless regime in that position be willing to crack down as hard as they have in the past? Because just one example, 2009 was the biggest uprising we've had, or one of the biggest uprisings we've had recently, the Green Movement. And many of those people now are dead, in jail, or in exile. I mean, the regime cracked down hard. I don't think we know, but that will be something interesting to watch. Is there a smooth transition in an election of a new supreme leader, or is there a period of chaos there? Stay tuned.
Relating to that, is there any chance that if Iran did become a nuclear power, it would make it more responsible, that it would, I know there's been some discussion of this, but do either of you think there's any chance that a nuclear-armed Iran would sort of step back from its proxy wars, from its sponsorship from terrorism, that the sort of the gravitas of being a nuclear-armed state would change its posture in the region?
In a word, no.
Well, I mean, one thing I've taken in a slightly different direction that I've, again, tying it back to the last question about regime change, is one of the other downsides of a nuclear-armed Iran is I think it could lock the current regime in power for even longer, because, as Andrew pointed out, many people have hoped for a long time that we would get a change to a better government in Iran. If this government acquired nuclear weapons, I think suddenly the international community actually has an interest in stability in Iran. We wouldn't want a revolution. What happens to the nuclear weapons? Do they fall into the hands of terrorists? Do you have a loose nukes problem? So I think that's another downside to a nuclear-armed Iran, is that maybe you get a 10 or 20-year life extension to the Islamic Republic.
I agree with that, and I think that's actually the principal argument for why stopping Iran from getting nuclear weapons is not just good for U.S. interests, it's also good for the interests of the Iranian people.
This is just kind of very unrelated, but as it's currently unfolding, and at least to my mind very strange, I was wondering what your take was on the Khashoggi, I think is how you pronounce it, affair. Like, what, basically, I'm confused with what the motivations of the Saudis are, and I'm wondering if either of you have any ideas on that. And I'm also wondering what you think the United States should do going forward. I know Mnuchin said he's no longer going to the conference. That seems pretty superficial, at least. Like, thinking long term, do you believe that the U.S. should be putting more pressure on the Saudis, say, to remove the crown prince? And I'm just wondering how you think that this incident will affect the region, the U.S. response.
First, why would MBS Mohammed bin Salman do this? He's in an autocratic political system. Autocratic political systems don't tend to like criticism. They don't have the free flow of debate we have in democracies, and Khashoggi was a critic. So I think it was a miscalculation on his part, but I think that was the motivation. He wanted to silence a critic. What will this mean for U.S.-Saudi relations going forward? Realistically, the relationship between countries isn't driven by how they treat a single individual, regardless of how prominent the case becomes. So the United States and Saudi have been partners for decades based on a number of shared interests. A shared interest in countering Iran, shared interest in free flow of energy out of the region. I think increasingly shared interest in how to deal with the terrorist threat. So those things aren't going away. So I suspect that the United States is unhappy with this. If we don't fully know what happened, but it's looking bad increasingly for Riyadh. And I think the United States it's put the United States in a difficult position. The Trump administration now has to deal with these criticisms, but I think the Trump administration sees that it still has these strategic interests with Saudi Arabia, is trying to tack back to reestablish those. So my best guess is that the Trump administration will take some measures to hold accountable the Saudis for what happened. Maybe the individuals involved will be sanctioned, their assets frozen, travel bans preventing them from coming to the United States or something like that. So I think there may be some punishment, but it's hard for me to see this fundamentally changing the nature of U.S.-Saudi relations going forward.
Two questions. One is if you could just provide your assessment of Bolton. And then two, do you consider nuclear war likely in the next 500 years? Bolton and that.
Really? I'm going to go first on this? I can go first if you prefer. Bolton, so fair disclosure, I've never met the guy. I've read his speeches, read his writings in and out of office in the Bush administration, out of office during the Obama administration, and now back in office. He's clearly an extremely knowledgeable, smart person. He's also, to my perception, like a fairly politic person. Like he understands how to say things in ways that influence policy and people's decision making that don't always necessarily reflect what he actually thinks. So I would just caution that anybody like Bolton, who's sort of known as a bomb thrower because he says controversial things in public, may not actually be such a bomb thrower in private. Like he's doing that to influence opinion and to, in some cases, instill credibility in some U.S. action. Like, in general, U.S. policymakers might comment to the press that, especially if they're not the actual person making the decision, that they support attacking Iran or attacking some other country, even if they do not actually support it because they're trying to establish credibility so that when the president makes a threat to use force, people believe it. On nuclear war, well, I don't know anything about 500 years from now. I think it's pretty unlikely in the next few years, at least I'll call it the foreseeable future. For simply the reason that everyone understands these things create massive, tragic massacres that almost everybody regrets having happened after the fact, even if it seemed exigent at the time, and that demands very severe punishment in return. And so as long as we have a world in which there are some states who are willing to pay costs to punish others for aggressive, terrible international behavior, that's unlikely to happen.
Yeah, so I think Bolton is smart, experienced, has a good relationship with the president. I think the things you would think you would need to be a national security advisor he has. I think a lot of people don't like him because they disagree with him politically, but a lot of people didn't like Susan Rice because they disagreed with her politically. So I think that goes with the territory to some degree, being in that kind of a position. On nuclear war, I think the risk has increased in recent years. And I think there was this 25-year period from the end of the Cold War until 2014 or so where we thought nuclear weapons were Cold War relics. Wasn't that silly the way the United States and Russia thought nuclear weapons mattered? Obama said, and I think rightly at the time, that the greatest nuclear threat was that a terrorist might get one and set one off. But unfortunately, in recent years, I think the threat of state-to-state nuclear conflict has come back. Russia is relying more on nuclear weapons in its strategy. North Korea's nuclear arsenal is expanding. So I think there are real state-to-state risks again. And just one anecdote on this, I've been teaching a course on nuclear weapons at Georgetown for about 10 years. And at the end of the class, I ask a very similar question. How many of you think you'll see nuclear war or a nuclear weapon being used in your lifetime? And when I first started teaching the class, 0 hands would go up. This is in 2008. 0 hands would go up, maybe 1 or 2 kind of, people who wanted to be different would raise their hands. I asked the question last spring, and so this is shortly after Fire and Fury and all that, but 60% of the hands went up. So a majority of students thought that they'd see nuclear weapons used in their life. And I'd have to say, if you ask me, like, gun to my head, I'm 40, so in the next 40 years or so, will I see a nuclear weapon used? I'd bet yes.
Oh my God. Wow.
Yeah.
That's depressing.
Can you tell us anything we may not know about the actual decision-making process that led to Trump pulling out? I know we kind of talked about that earlier, but who convinced him to do it? How was the decision made? And then also, how important is the national security advisor position to foreign policy?
I'll take the last one first, maybe. So Bolton, I think Bolton actually said, "I'm the national security advisor, not the national security decision maker." So at the end of the day, a deal of this importance, it's only the president who makes the decision. And there are different models for the national security advisor. So there's the so-called honest broker model that Brent Scowcroft was really seen as kind of perfecting, of bringing the cabinet officials together and making sure the president got all views and the pros and cons, and then letting the president decide. There's kind of the more of the strategist model that Henry Kissinger really kind of embodied, of having strong views of his own and trying to influence the president to go in that direction. I think McMaster was clearly more of the Scowcroft model of trying to tee up options and letting the president decide. I don't have any insight into what kind of national security advisor Bolton is, but given his experience and strong opinions on the outside, I would suspect he's maybe a little bit more in the Kissinger role, that he has opinions and tries to influence the process. If the Iran agreement would be an example of that, where he was one of the most vocal critics of the deal on the outside, lobbied for and argued for pulling out, and then shortly after he came into the position, Trump did decide to pull out. I think Bolton started in early April and Trump pulled out in early May.
I have a couple of questions, and maybe it's naive of me to say this, but I think we're speaking this way as if there's some way that they're actually honestly abiding, when you've already said that you've caught them cheating, that Israel was able to develop nuclear weapons without us even knowing about it, and then that was at a time when we didn't even have the technology that we have now, and that it's clearly in their interest, as you stated in the beginning, to have nuclear weapons so that they can establish a power base in that area, but that there are all other chess pieces lined up to jump to the fore, that politically everybody acts as though they're on board with this agreement, as though the elephant in the room is not that they can't cheat and lie and be doing stuff underneath, that the economic sanctions that we pretend have an effect on them, and visibly they do, but clearly they're only 1 year away, if they make a dash from it, to getting nuclear weapons. So I think it would be foolish to assume that they're not every day developing something in a way that Israel was developing things that we just weren't aware of. So that Trump actually pulling out of the deal and forcing things, forcing the issue to make things happen now, today, is probably the best decision. Because there's no telling what we don't know. Obviously, we know what's on the surface, but what's going on beneath the surface, clearly it's in their best interest. So I wonder if you can comment on that.
So, I think both of us agree that the Iranian regime would like to have a nuclear weapon. All of these problems would get a lot easier for Iran if they had nuclear weapons. But, I think there are important differences in the case you cited, Israel and Iran. So the degree of access the United States and the international community have to exactly what's going on with Iran's nuclear program is orders of magnitude higher than the United States had with Israel in the 1950s and 1960s. There was no equivalent of IAEA cameras installed at essentially every nuclear relevant facility in Iran. That didn't exist in Israel. That's why Israel could do these things and have the United States not know for sure what was going on. I think in part, the point of the deal was to establish a monitoring apparatus which would greatly raise the probability that if Iran was doing anything on the side covertly, it wouldn't remain covert for long. And my view is, it's a little hard to explain without getting into the technical details, but basically at every stage, from pulling rocks out of the ground that contain things that could eventually be made into nuclear bomb fuel, to the stage of actually having the nuclear bomb fuel, there is now international access to witness all of these things. So the international community is keeping track of exactly how much natural uranium Iran is mining from its mines all over the country as a result of the agreement, so that we know this is exactly how much uranium they get out of the ground. we can look at later stages in the process and say, does the uranium we see being put into centrifuges for reactor fuel exactly correspond to the amount they're bringing out of the ground? And if it doesn't, we know they must be hiding some of it. So now we know they violated the agreement somehow. So I actually think the agreement is quite good at giving us confidence, at least as long as it's in place, that the Iranians are not, in fact, pursuing this on the side, even though they would like to. And I tend to think that one risk of pulling out of the agreement is precisely that if the Iranians retaliate for the U.S. pulling out by doing something partial, like, say, kicking out IAEA inspection equipment from certain facilities on grounds that, hey, if the U.S. isn't going to abide by this agreement, then we're going to make changes to it, it's going to be very difficult for the United States to be able to claim that the problem here is Iran and not us, because Iran did it explicitly in reaction to what the U.S. has done.
So let me jump in, because I agree with both of you, I think. I agree that there are basically two inspections regimes in the deal. One is for declared facilities and one is for undeclared facilities. So I agree with Andrew, the inspections regime for declared facilities is pretty good, all the way from mines up through the uranium enrichment. So we have good insight into what Iran's doing there. The problem is the undeclared facilities. So the Parchin military base, for example, where we're pretty sure that Iran did work on nuclear weapons design and testing in the past. We wanted to get access to that, and the Iranians said, well, it's a military base. You wouldn't let us come onto your military bases. It's a military base. You can inspect there. So I wouldn't be surprised if Iran was doing work related to nuclear weapons design still, or on a military base. And we wouldn't know about it. We wouldn't have any way of, we'd have other ways, intelligence. So I think it's very unlikely that they're, going back to my first step, you have to make the fuel, you have to design the warhead, and you have to have the ballistic missiles. So I think we're seeing their ballistic missile program, and it's expanding, and that's a problem that's not covered in the deal. Making the fuel, I think it's unlikely that they actually are making fuel that we don't know about. When they tried to do this in the past, even without the deal, we caught them twice. We caught them at Natanz before they were just digging a hole in the ground, basically, and we caught them before they were actually producing the fuel, and then they admitted it. Same thing at Qom, before they were actually producing fuel, we caught them and they admitted it. And now we have even more intrusive inspection. So I think it's unlikely that they're making fuel, because that's kind of a big process with a lot of steps. I think it's unlikely they're making fuel that we don't know about. They're doing ballistic missiles and we can see it, it's a problem. But I think that second step of the warhead design, which is not as important as the fuel, but it is still of concern. I wouldn't be surprised if that's going on in a military base and we don't know about it.
All right, well, please join me in thanking Matt and Andrew for sharing their expertise.
Great. Thanks, that was fun.
I tried to make it more argumentative. You're so reasonable.
Thanks.
Thank you.